rocky shores. Frigid ocean waves crashed against the jagged cliffs, sending up plumes of salty spray. The wind howled, whipping Sue Storm's golden hair as she made her way along the narrow path. The craggy shoreline was treacherous, but she pressed on, driven by a sense of dread. Something was out there, lurking beneath the inky black waters. An ancient evil had awakened, drawn to the rocky shores of New York by an unknown force. Sue could feel its sinister presence, a dark and hungry power that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. As she rounded the final bend, the sprawling ruins of an old manor house came into view. The once grand structure was little more than a crumbling shell, its windows shattered and its walls eroded by relentless storms. A faint luminescence flickered within, as if the house itself was alive. Sue paused, every fiber of her being screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to know what was happening, had to confront the nameless horror that had emerged from the depths. Steeling her nerves, she pressed onward, her footsteps echoing on the weathered stones. The manor's grand entryway was a gaping maw, darkness swallowing her as she stepped inside. Sue paused, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. Shattered chandeliers dangled overhead, their crystal shards glittering like fangs. Rubble crunched underfoot, and the air was thick with the scent of damp and decay. A faint scratching sound reached her ears, like the skittering of 1,000 tiny legs. Sue whirled around, but saw nothing. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it were alive and watching her. Swallowing her fear, Sue pressed on, her footsteps quickening as she navigated the crumbling corridors. She had to find the source of the disturbance, had to confront whatever evil had awakened in this forgotten place. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and Sue realized she was nearing the coast. She followed the noise, her heart pounding in her chest, until she reached a set of ancient stone stairs that led down to a cavernous chamber. The air was thick with the stench of brine and decay, and Sue coughed, covering her nose and mouth. Squinting, she peered into the gloom, and what she saw made her blood run cold. At the center of the chamber, a massive tentacled creature writhed and thrashed, its slick, segmented limbs grasping at the air. It was a leviathan, a primordial horror that had lain dormant for untold ages, awakened by some unknowable force. Sue stared, transfixed by the sight of the creature, its maw opening to reveal row upon row of serrated teeth. She could feel its hunger, its malevolent hunger, as it sensed her presence and turned its attention toward her. Without hesitation, Sue activated her powers, her body becoming transparent as she transformed into the invisible woman. She needed to buy herself time, to figure out a way to defeat this ancient evil. The creature let out a deafening roar, its tentacles lashing out and slamming against the walls of the chamber. Sue dodged and weaved, her agility the only thing keeping her alive as the monster's limbs sought to ensnare her. She fired blasts of concentrated force, striking the creature's flanks and causing it to recoil in pain. But her attacks seemed to have little effect, and she could feel her strength beginning to wane. Desperately, Sue looked around the chamber, searching for any sign of a weakness. The creature's movements were erratic, its attention divided as it thrashed and writhed. Perhaps, if she could find a way to disorient it, she might stand a chance. Inspiration struck, and Sue began to gather energy, focusing it into a series of powerful force fields. Shimmering barriers sprang up all around the chamber, enclosing the creature in a constricting cage. The leviathan roared in fury, its tentacles lashing out in a frenzied attempt to break free. But Sue's fields held firm, the creature's movements growing more and more erratic as it struggled against its imprisonment. Seizing her chance, Sue unleashed a barrage of focused force blasts, striking the creature's vulnerable underbelly. The leviathan howled in agony, its massive bulk slamming against the walls of the chamber. For a moment, it seemed as if Sue had gained the upper hand. But then the creature's thrashing grew even more intense, and she realized with horror that it was beginning to break free. Desperate, Sue poured more and more energy into her force fields, but the strain was taking a toll. She could feel her powers weakening, her energy reserves dwindling. If she didn't find a way to end this soon, she knew she wouldn't survive. The leviathan's massive head suddenly surged forward, its jaws opening wide. Sue barely had time to react, throwing up a hastily constructed shield. Just as the creature's teeth clamped down, the impact sent shockwaves through her body, and Sue cried out in pain. Her force field shattered, and she was flung backward, slamming against the wall of the chamber. Dazed and disoriented, Sue struggled to regain her footing, but the creature was relentless, its tentacles lashing out and wrapping around her, pinning her in place. Sue fought against the constricting grip, her lungs burning as the life was squeezed from her. She could feel the creature's hot, fetid breath on her face, its putrid stench overwhelming her senses. As the world began to grow dark, Sue knew that she had to act, had to find a way to break free. Summoning the last of her strength, she focused her powers, creating a series of concentrated force blasts that exploded against the creature's flesh. The Leviathan howled in pain, its grip loosening just enough for Sue to wriggle free. She stumbled, gasping for air, her body aching from the assault. But she didn't have time to rest. The creature was recovering, its attention fixed on her once more. Sue knew that she had to end this, had to find a way to defeat the ancient evil that had awakened in this forgotten place. Steeling her nerves, she began to gather her energy, pouring everything she had into a massive force field. The shimmering barrier expanded, filling the chamber and pressing in on the Leviathan. The creature thrashed and roared, its tentacles lashing out in a desperate attempt to break free. But Sue's field held firm, the pressure building until the creature's screams turned to agonized shrieks. Suddenly, there was a deafening crack, and the Leviathan's body began to split apart, its flesh tearing under the relentless force of Sue's powers. The creature's thrashing grew weaker and weaker, until finally it went limp, its massive bulk collapsing to the floor of the chamber. Sue stood there, trembling, her body drained of energy. She had done it, had vanquished the ancient evil that had threatened to consume her. But at what cost? As she turned to leave, Sue realized that the manor house had fallen silent, the eerie glow that had flickered within now extinguished. The air was still, the only sound the distant roar of the waves against the cliffs. Wearily, Sue made her way back up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the deafening silence. She emerged into the night, the stars overhead shining like a million tiny beacons. For a moment she stood there, letting the cool breeze wash over her. Then, with a heavy heart, she turned and began the long walk back, leaving the ancient horrors of the manor behind.